Hello, folks. I'm here with anarchist playwright and comic book writer Brenton Langle. And we're going to do one of our famous follow-up recaps. A friend of mine called this a Sports Center segment. Just kind of following up on my recent debate with Adam Kokesh, the famous libertarian voluntarist. So what are your thoughts, Brent? I want to comment second because I was part of it. So I want to get the outside of you first.
You really had your hustle going out there, Caleb. Sorry, that's my John Madden impression or whatever. I gotta say that was an interesting debate. You did really well and came off really well. Adam, I think, was not particularly prepared. Clearly, he was kind of all over the place. Like his opening statement, he even had to stop and ask you to clarify some things because he hadn't prepared anything. And unfortunately, the internet gods were not with him because there was a lot of connectivity issues that I think, even if you hadn't had the dynamic that you did in that, it would have, it would have made the day go strongly against him within that. But yeah, I thought that it was a really interesting conversation. There were a lot of times I wanted to jump in there and yell something because there were a lot of arguments that I knew were going to come up, and you didn't respond to them in the way I would have. You almost didn't take the bait. You stayed on your messaging as opposed to arguing with him about his points about self-ownership. And I thought that was a really interesting tactic because it seemed like what he wanted to do was pull you into a very abstract and moralistic argument, and you kept it grounded in the real. And I feel like that was definitely a really solid move for that debate.
Yeah, he really wanted to go there and have a conversation about what does it mean to own yourself, and of course that leads to then coercion, economic coercion, and all of that. And I just didn't really want to go there. I did ask him multiple times to explain how his society would stay anarchist or voluntary or anarcho-capitalist or whatever, and how when you have huge amounts of differentiation in wealth, how the people with lots more wealth would then not go and rig the government. What would be the mechanism to keep, us
from happening?
One. And I asked him that like 3 times, and each time he gave me an answer that sounded like he didn't even really understand what the question was. So I kind of gave up after a while, and I figured, okay, well, the audience probably knows what I'm getting at. Maybe he doesn't. So what did you make of that?
I think it was your terminology that confused him.
Mm-hmm.
He should have gotten it because this is a point that has been brought up before. You and I brought it up in our debate with the libertarian chair guy, a friend of mine. I'm blanking on his name at the moment.
Sure.
Yeah, but in our first modern day debate, we brought it up with him, and he didn't really have an answer for it. I don't think if Kokesh had understood what you were saying, he would have had an answer for it. Because really, what I think you needed to ask it to him in a way that he would understand is, what is to stop the wealthy people who succeed in an voluntary society from creating a state?
Yeah.
And you essentially framed it as, what is it, what is to stop them from altering the government? I think that's what confused him, because he was thinking there isn't a government to, because I think that's really where he's kind of coming from. He's just imagining like if you waved a magic wand, boom, no government. Or really what I see out of a lot of like anarcho-capitalists, they seem to think that if everyone adopts their very specific idea of ethics and morals, that if everyone subscribes to the NAP, suddenly they'll just decide not to have a government because, well, obviously that's coercion. What they don't understand is that what is and is not coercion and what is and is not aggression, it's 100% subjective, and they're never going to be able to actually reconcile that with like the way that because they don't think of their systems in reality. They think of their systems only in their heads, which is why they get tripped up so often, because like they will assume that like ways of organizing that humans have and human culture, they will assume that situations that are created by the state are actually natural situations that happen on their own, and they see government imposition on that as an imposition on the natural state of nature. So Adam Kokesh, I guarantee you, and the guy that I debated last night, Keith Knight, or well, it wasn't really a debate, it was a discussion. But I guarantee you, because we talked about this, they do not understand that private property is a creation of the state, that it has been brought about by state violence. And you actually brought this up when you talked about, I love that you brought up, hunter-gatherer societies, primitive communism, and that, private property is the exception and not the rule. That was really good to hear, and I'm glad that came in, because they have no historical analysis like that.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me a little bit. I mean, Bakunin was anti-capitalist, but there was an exchange between him and Marx, where Marx basically says to him, okay, in your stateless communist world, how are you going to prevent somebody from getting together and forming capitalism again by taking everyone else's, stuff or whatever? And Bakunin says famously, well, we're going to have this group called the Association that will be organized to prevent any counter-revolution. And Marx says that association sounds an awful lot like a state now, doesn't it? I mean, that's the exchange, and that kind of goes back and forth. And there's a line from Lenin where he says that, like, I guess there's an argument about who will direct a ship on the sea, right? If there's no captain, right? And he says, well, we'll elect a committee. And it's like, okay, so you're going to have a group of captains then. I mean, if you just change the name, you don't change what it actually is or something like that. I mean, that's kind of an exchange.
Or in the case of anarcho-capitalists, it's, we're going to have these private defense firms that will protect people. It's just a state by another name. Now, I will say there is actually an answer to that I don't know if Bakunin went into this or not, because I haven't read it. But I mean, I always think of it like this. To a certain extent, I think humans are naturally always going to create an institution for the creation and mediation of policy. For anarchists, that's the GA. We saw that at Occupy Wall Street, and it works very well in some ways, has some problems in others. But then you've got the state. And, there are two approaches to the state, but I would say to a certain extent, the state is, humans coming together and organizing towards the proper use of violence, essentially, within the society. To one extent or another, you can't really get rid of that entirely. I don't think, because nothing's perfect, and there will always be probably some sort of organization or constabulary or whatever. Like you even talked about how police forces function differently in different countries like Vietnam, and I was really happy to hear that. I would have also said Iceland, which is nominally capitalist, but like Iceland, their police, in the time that it's been a country, their police have only shot I think they shot their first person ever just a few years ago, and it was a crazy guy with a shotgun who'd completely lost his mind. But also Iceland had nowhere near the levels of crime that Europe and the rest of the capitalist world were experiencing until they made these neoliberal capitalist reforms and started to take on a more tiered society with greater levels of economic inequality, and then suddenly their crime exploded and got more to the level of what they had to deal with in just per capita in Europe and America. So, I think policing in a lot of ways has a lot to do. Poverty and inequality is what drives most crime and most antisocial behavior. So I think the answer, if you're trying to do a stateless society, if you're asking me as an anarchist, how are you going to do it? I would say to create an institution that is as horizontal as possible. I've looked at the anarchist militias from the Spanish Civil War, where everybody essentially has the same rank, or the rank is very, there is rank, but everyone draws the same pay. There's not, a general or you can go and slap a general on the back and ask him for a cigarette if you're a private, if you need to. And, he's not going to go off and, work in a building in a whole nother country and live in a mansion somewhere. you know. So I think the anarchist answer to how you deal with the issue of the state is to create an institution that functions like the state, but is less hierarchical. And as it being and in being less hierarchical, it is less vulnerable to corruption that we see through the state.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, what stood out to me was that while so much, and I pointed this out to Adam, that so much of the libertarian community has, gone in this white nationalist, Donald Trump, economic nationalist, Bannonist,
I
America
loved
direction.
watching you ask him that.
Yeah, he continues to just kind of do his own thing. He supports the Chaz out in Seattle. And I said, I mean, I feel like I would be mad if I was you. And he didn't really have an answer to that. And he said something like, there's a lot of bait in there, I believe was his answer. I don't know what he thought I was baiting him to say. I wasn't trying to get him to say anything. I was just pointing out that that he's gone one way and the libertarian movement has largely gone another. What do you make of that?
I think he couldn't say that it made him angry, because if he said it made him angry, to them, it makes him look weak. These are people who, a lot of the alt-right, you saw how like the Stryker and Enoch fans were like a bunch of freaking internet trolls, and not even good internet trolls, just, jerks who misunderstood the whole concept of trolling. And, there was a lot of like, oh, you mad bro coming out of them. So I think he kind of couldn't say that he was mad about it. So I think that's why he went on that nonsensical rant right there. But, you could tell that he was affected by the question. Yeah, I mean, I would say what really annoyed me about the whole thing was that even libertarians, like right libertarians, love to do this thing where they will virtue signal. And they virtue signal in such a way where they say, I am so principled that I will tolerate this awful thing. I will fight for it. And, it's why, like, the guys they'll run right up to you and like be like, oh, well, what if the child consents? They really have this. Yeah, it is disgusting. And like, it's very immoral, but to them, because they have this sort of idea of liberal tolerance being like the highest, greatest virtue, they really think that makes them look principled and strong. And so, like, of course, Adam Kokesh, even with all of this, has to be like, oh yeah, all these horrible white nationalists that want to organize and commit genocide and stuff, I'll let them organize. I'll let them build their societies. I'll let them have their whites-only communities, and I'll hate it, but I'll let it happen. And I think he genuinely is disgusted by that stuff. But again, it's this really twisted ethic that is completely divorced from reality, and it's completely divorced from, the anarchist and the socialist movements. Like, it's
well, right. You can't build one of those ethno states without some level of coercion. I mean, that's the thing. He says as long as it's voluntary, he's okay with it. Well, okay, so we're going to carve out a section of the United States. It's the whites only section. I can guarantee you there's going to be people there who aren't white. They're going to have to be forcibly deported. Then on top of that, right? I mean, there's a lot of transport, right? There's a lot of black truck drivers out there. Well, they can't drive through there, right? It wouldn't be safe for them to drive through there. I mean, and then they'd be asking the federal government to help them enforce this, or at least protect their right to enforce it. What if other states said, well, we're going to infringe on this. We're not going to cooperate with your ethnic separatism. They would need the federal government to come in and mediate it. I mean, there's no way that you could have an ethno state without coercion. So for him to say, well, I'm okay with that as long as there's no coercion involved, there's an element of naivete. He's taking the white nationalist movement at their word, which I don't think people should ever do.
No, because Nazis lie.
Yes, they do.
I don't know if people realize that.
Right. And it also made me think about, there was that Saturday Night Live sketch where they show a bunch of white nationalists sitting around with their Confederate flags, talking about how they want to build an all-white country. And that one guy says, well, that sounds like Vermont. And they all just keep saying, that sounds like Vermont. And then they all leave for Vermont. And they're like making a dig about Vermont being all white and rural or something like that. But I remember watching that and wondering, are they subtly trying to call Bernie Sanders a Nazi? And I wondered that, if they were kind of subtly alluding to that, because there's a lot of other states in the USA that are pretty white. You know what I mean? I mean, in terms of that.
I mean, white nationalists literally did that in Oregon and Washington State.
Oh, really?
Yeah. After the Civil War, like, there were a number of like, people who were so racist they just didn't want black people around them at all, and they tried to build a white paradise in the Pacific Northwest. And that, you talk about, like, the Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. I mean, Portland and that area has been subject to a war that's been going on between, this sort of lefty anarchist faction up there that's anti-racist, and like groups like the Proud Boys and the and Patriot Prayer, that were exposed. Patriot Prayer and Andy Ngo were exposed by an Antifa infiltrator when they were trying to start that fight at Cider Riot and then try to blame it on Antifa. And that's because, like, the history is that area, there is a large portion of people that moved up there so that could be the closest thing to a white ethno state they could live in. And, that's not how anything works ever. It's like, there was a Russell Brand sketch that I really liked, where he was just like, people getting mad about immigrants, where they're just like, stop moving around. I can't relax when people are moving. It's like, it's like they want to take society and just stop everything. Everyone stays exactly where they are. No races mix. No one moves from country to country. No one moves from state to state. Everybody just stands still, because I can't freaking stand it when there's change.
Yeah, well, that reminds me of Utah and, New Zion and the Mormons and all of that. Because what's interesting is that the character of Mormonism really changed when they got to Utah. And many people have commented on that. When the Mormons started out, yeah, they were a wacky cult, Joseph Smith and the Golden Plates and all of that. But they were really against slavery. They were vehemently opposed to slavery. There were even black members of the early Mormon church. And they were very opposed to slavery, and they were almost kind of socialistic. Like, they held all things in common, and all their businesses were kind of cooperative. And
like
they had
the early Christians.
Yeah, and they had polygamy, so they kept getting kicked out of places for having polygamy. But, and then we know Joseph Smith was killed, I believe in Missouri, if I'm not mistaken. And then they moved farther west, and it was when they got to Utah, when they were killing the Native Americans, and they set up kind of a settler colony. That's when a lot of the real racism that people associate with the Mormon Church started, right? That they were killing the Native Americans on the basis that they were a lost tribe of Israel that had killed Jesus or something like that. And they were banning African Americans and black people, and that their character changed. And that's, you can look at that, that the character of a group changes when they start becoming a settler colonial state. You know what I mean? I think when Israel started, the intention of a lot of the early settlers was that they were going to build kind of a socialist commune in the desert, right, with the kibbutz and all of that. But then you get there, there's already people living there. You're fighting against them. Suddenly you're very militarized. You're changing your viewpoint. It's us versus them. And it changes things. And I think that Utah, is kind of an example of that. And that, Mormonism up until the mid 70s was a racist religion. There's a photograph of Mitt Romney and Obama shaking hands, and it says, 40 years ago, he could have been kicked out of his church for this. And that's how these things develop. And that we in America have a weird, because of our settler history and because so many religious groups fled Europe and set up shop here, we tolerate people setting up their own little cult in the woods a lot more than other societies would. In France, if you wanted to be Amish on your own, they might let you. But the second you had kids and were saying, I'm going to raise kids without electricity and running water, children's services would be there and your kids would be taken away and you might be going to jail for child abuse, and that would be the end of your little religious group. But here in the USA, we have this tolerance. We have this belief that everyone can kind of do their own thing. And it doesn't seem to just apply to Christian religious groups. There's Muslim communities in upstate New York, from what I understand, and in California. There have been little like Marxist and utopian leftist communities. In Indiana for a long time there was New Harmony, which was set up by Robert Owen. And that's a weird aspect of America. So when Adam Kokesh invokes that, he's kind of tapping into something in the American spirit that's very much a part of this country. Would you agree?
I would agree 100%. And if you can, Daniel Fishman, That's who it was.
Yes. Okay.
He said that like his ideal time to be alive, or what he was trying to create, was something akin to the Wild West. And Kokesh kept going on and talking about homesteading and how important it was to acquire property justly, which was ridiculous because, where were they homesteading? They were homesteading in the property of the Native Americans, and most of it was stolen or tricked away from them, and what couldn't be stolen and tricked away from them was taken by force. Famously, Manhattan was sold for a handful of beads, and they kind of tell that story, and they're like, oh, how great is it that the settlers paid for Manhattan? But the fact is, they went to the Indians, or the Native Americans at the time, the tribe in the area, and they said, hey, we want to be on this island. Here's a handful of beads. And the tribe is like, okay, anybody can be on that island. Thanks for the beads. But, on the other end of it, it was like the settlers were like, ha, you took the beads. It's ours now forever. And suddenly, we talked in our last stream about Tecumseh and like how ridiculous the Native Americans thought it was, the idea of selling land in the same way that it was as ridiculous to sell land as it might be to sell air or the sea to us.
Well, and what was particularly interesting is not only was it unfair in the fact that it was stolen from the Native Americans, but even among the white settlers, it wasn't like everyone just got their little piece of land, right? We hear these like in old like cowboy movies, they show like, well, they like open a race and whoever gets their stake to the land, that's not how it was done. The railroad companies ended up with the majority of the land in a very, very, it was handed out in a very, very nepotistic, unfair way.
And it was used to abuse people, company towns.
Yeah. I mean, it was just wildly unfair to the Native Americans, to the African American slaves on the plantations, to the white settlers. It wasn't even fair among them. There's no way, and that's why this argument that you'll often hear from defenders of capitalism, they'll say, well, socialism is theft. Well, no, capitalism is theft, and socialism is retaking some of what's stolen already. That capitalism began with a mass episode of theft, the clearing of the commons and all of that. And that's one of the fallacies in a lot of the Ayn Rand stuff. It's like, well, the capitalists all just worked hard with the sweat of their brow and we want to take it all from them. And that's just a naive understanding of how things work.
Well, it's because they don't understand that property is theft. And I mean, like, they don't understand that this situation with property is created by the state. Again, he doesn't have... Kokesh doesn't have any concept of the Enclosure Acts in Britain. He doesn't understand that, as you wanted to bring up in your debate with Molyneux that never wound up getting brought up, that Adam Smith was watching essentially a war between the feudal Scots and the capitalist British, and he was watching, essentially colonialism be imposed on Scotland and going like, yay, it's great, these people are killing my countrymen and modernizing us. Kokesh, like, when he talks, he's like, oh, well, homesteading, we have this right to homesteading. Okay, so first off, that's from the Homestead Acts that were imposed by the government. So you don't actually have a right to homesteading. That perception that this is a right is created by the state and by a mandate from the state that was backed up by state violence. Secondly, like, it kind of goes back a little bit in philosophy to like John Locke and his second treatise on civil government, the reason that the great and chief end of men uniting into commonwealths is the protection of their property. And so, they talk about this self-ownership, which makes no sense and is philosophically unfounded, but because you own yourself, you go and you mix your labor with the land, and this somehow magically becomes your land. And that's where their entire ethos comes from. But what they don't have the historical or the philosophical or the political knowledge to realize this is a creation of the state.
And why doesn't that apply to factory workers, right? I mean, there's been talk of sweat equity, right? And that worker goes to that job every day and sweats and works hard, and doesn't he have a stake in the factory then if he works there? I mean, if working the land makes you an owner of it, does working the factory not make you an owner of it?
And wouldn't the owner of the factory be the physical people who actually went and built the factory, not the money man who paid for it? So it's an incoherent ideology that I really think is possibly built to be broken and may even actually be like a psyop, and we may figure this out in 40 years or so.
Well, that's one of the things I raised with him, is that if you look into libertarian politics when it was at its height, like I said, I think libertarianism has kind of peaked. I mean, now it's gone into alt-right and all that. But when it was at its height, it had this nasty Ku Klux Klan underbelly, right? You had your sincere libertarians like Adam Kokesh and others.
Yeah.
But there was always this layer of people, and it's, Barack Obama is a communist who's going to take away your gun. And
a secret Muslim, and also the Antichrist.
And you go to the Tea Party and you talk to them, and you really ought to read the Blue Book by the John Birch Society. And the USA has been communist ever since Roosevelt came in, and that's why he got us into this unnecessary war against the Nazis, who were actually just trying to save Germany from communism. And it's like there's this nasty far right underbelly. Someone once said to me during that time, they said, I've noticed that a lot of the people that were calling themselves Ku Klux Klan in the 70s and 80s are now suddenly calling themselves libertarians. In Cleveland, there was a libertarian guy who used to come to all the meetings. I used to go to the Northeast Ohio Anti-War Coalition meetings. And there was a guy who used to come to those meetings. He was a Libertarian Party member. His name was David Macko. And he would bring a magazine with him that he would just give everyone a copy of. Just a libertarian magazine. It was called American Free Press. And in the back of it, it had ads for Holocaust denial publications, and it was a white nationalist publication that he was handing out. And this guy, he was a member of the John Birch Society, and he'd been ejected actually from John Birch Society meetings because the Birchers have a rule that you can't discuss Holocaust denial. So he'd even been too far right for the Birchers even. But he was just going around and trying to integrate himself into left circles and say, I'm a libertarian, and that was going on, and that a lot of these far right elements tried to kind of become libertarians. And now that the Trump stuff has come along, they've kind of moved ahead. And now that libertarians are kind of like harmless, they have these meetups, I think, they have these conferences and hotels, and it's like these like smiley, perky little kids that are like smiling. I want to open my own business, and boy, golly, I don't want the government to mess with it. Oh, gee, I love it.
And they're all wearing fedoras and bow ties.
Yeah, and you talk to some of them, and you realize that what it is, it's like they have very, very authoritarian parents that are Republicans. And so being a libertarian is a way they can kind of rebel, but not question the ideology they've been spoon-fed. It's just like, well, I just believe I want the government's hands off. They take kind of a section of Republican talking points and blow it up, but they don't talk about the United States being a country founded on racism. They don't question this sacred right to private property. They definitely don't question the idea that capitalism is good. And it's a way that kind of like these kind of like meeker, younger personalities that are, from very hard right, conservative Republican families can kind of assert their independence and be perky. It's kind of a suburban middle class kind of movement. I see it as now. And
identity politics for shopkeepers.
Yeah. And it's been a little bit weakened, I think, that the Tea Parties, right? I mean, it used to be, Alex Jones and the Tea Partiers and all of them. The Libertarian Party was, it was kind of scary, the libertarian gatherings, and all that. Now it just kind of seems like this meek kind of, it's like an intellectual conversation they're having about the ideal world with no force.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so libertarianism, I should say, and I'm going to out myself, and this, but your audience may not. So I was a right libertarian in college. So like in high school, I was a Republican. And I was a Republican because my dad was a Republican, is a Republican, and I had a good relationship with my dad, and I grew up fairly well off. He was a doctor. I was still from a working class background. Like my grandfather drove a bakery truck, so we had risen from there. But my grandfather had been a Democrat. My dad rebelled against him and became a Republican. And I was a Republican through till college. And in college, in my first year, I had a gay roommate, and we got into a discussion about politics, and he mentioned he was a libertarian. And I'm like, well, what's a libertarian? That sounds great. I love the idea of liberty. What's this? And he described it as, well, I have conservative economic values and liberal social values. And I'm like, oh, that's me. because at the time I was still fairly conservative because I didn't realize, I didn't understand systemic racism. I didn't understand what communism or socialism actually was. I'd never actually worked like a real job before, where you're on your own and you're getting abused by your employer. So I was just like, oh yeah, that sounds great, because I think things are fine, and also I don't hate gay people, and the Republicans seem to hate gay people, so I'm a libertarian now, and I did that all through college. And it wasn't really until I had worked a job for the first time, out of college, where I worked for this company that had it was a good resume builder, but, they would do illegal stuff like work 80 hours a week, but split it between two different companies. So they didn't pay us any overtime, and we had to turn over our tips to our manager, and they said, well, the only reason we can afford to pay you a salary is if you give me all your tips.
Wow.
And, a lot of us put up with it because we were artists, and this was the only way to be a full-time artist in the Midwest. But after almost a year of that, and like literally having no time to myself at all, like my parents would try to send me a care package, and I would either be at work or dead asleep and not able to get it. I kind of realized, this is a little messed up. And it's almost like, I don't know, have you ever seen that show Gilmore Girls?
I haven't, no.
Okay, there's an episode of Gilmore Girls where one of the characters in there, this girl Paris, is like, she tends to be this kind of severe conservative, kind of upper crusty New Englander, and she has to get a real job in one episode of the show, and like winds up working in the kitchen, and as soon as she gets the job, she becomes like a Marxist and
Wow.
starts having problems with the other people and quoting Lenin and stuff.
Wow.
And it was almost like that, where you get someone who's smart and educated enough, and you put them in an abusive work environment, and suddenly just bam, socialism looks so good to them.
Well, right, and that's kind of the opposite of how things were during the Cold War, right? That used to be, it used to be that people like you and I would be kind of ridiculed by, oh, well, all the working class people love capitalism. It's you, hoity-toity leftists who've never had a real job. You're the ones that are revolutionaries. But as we saw, I think around the time of the financial crisis, I started to notice that wasn't the case. I started to talk to people, and I remember I took some classes at a community college, and I noticed that I had been at this, liberal arts college, and the people there were very unreceptive to socialism. But I was starting to take classes at a community college where people were working full-time jobs. People were very receptive to socialism. And again, that was probably true for the bulk of the Cold War, but it stopped being true around 2008, 2009. The culture started changing. And that
I think part of that's the fall of the USSR too, because in the United States, they had to make things nice for the workers because they were afraid of a communist revolution. They had to be like, oh, we take great care of our workers here. And then as soon as the USSR went away, they were like, oh, what, you're still here? I guess go die in a gutter somewhere.
Yeah, and there was a wave of of privatizations and union busting and austerity and stuff, and it has continued. I mean, and especially since the financial crisis. It's just continued to get worse, and the roads are falling apart. The water's not being properly purified. Everything just seems to be falling apart, and the government is making sure that the rich can just keep enriching themselves as things get worse. And that was one of the points that came up, as he said, well, war doesn't create wealth; it destroys wealth. Well, that's the situation we're in, is the capitalists ensure their monopolies by destroying wealth. It creates wealth for weapons manufacturers. He admitted that much, but that's the sad reality, is society overall is getting poorer while a few group of people enrich themselves. That capitalism used to be based on growth, and now capitalism is based on growth for a few people at the expense of the rest of society, making the rest of the society poor, and that's the nature of the crisis that we're in.
Yeah, well, and this is one of the facts of economics. So in a country with a fiat currency, any money that is printed and then spent internally within the country, you can actually do that, and you can print virtually as much money as you want to fund anything, so long as there is really the political will, and it will not cause inflation if it is spent inside the country, as long as there are enough goods and services to go around, so the economy has to actually be growing while you print this money. But which it always is in capitalism, because if it's not growing, you're in a crash. But and this was actually admitted by Alan Greenspan, on the floor of the Senate. I think Rand Paul or Paul Ryan or somebody was talking to him and trying to get him to say, we can't fund Social Security anymore. There's no way for us to. And Alan Greenspan, Randy and Alan Greenspan had to admit, no, actually, we totally can fund it. And you've seen it with the bailouts that they were able to do when they were able to cut everybody a check and boost stuff. They've always been able to do this. But what they do is they print the money. And because there is always the political will to give that money to the military, and there is not necessarily the political will to give it to hospitals and schools and layabouts because of the Protestant work ethic, you get this military industrial complex where they throw all of this money at the military, and then when wars aren't being fought, they start throwing that money at the police force. And really what's happening is because when the government is in the red, the people are in the black, or would be if the corporations weren't getting all of this money, because they could be taking that money and investing it in, arts organizations and hospitals and schools and all the things that we need, food, medicine. But again, nobody wants to do that because we have this resistance to it for a number of cultural and economic factors. So they just throw it at war, throw it at war, throw it at war. It's basically an infinite money machine. And again, he doesn't have the economic education to realize that.
Yeah, that's where I've often made the differentiation between Keynes and Schacht, right? Because John Maynard Keynes, the Great Depression comes along. He's not going to be a communist, he's a capitalist British defender, but he says,
we need explicitly said he was on the side of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah. Well, he says we need the government to spend money. There's a problem of underconsumption. John Maynard Keynes says you can go hire someone to dig a ditch and pay them, and then pay somebody else to fill it back in, but then they all have money, and that's John Maynard Keynes. It's just this notion the government should spend money, right? But Hjalmar Schacht, the Nazi economist, he actually is on record saying he was opposed to ditch digging. And his idea was, we're going to reboot the German economy by having the government spend money on military hardware and on mechanisms of repression like concentration camps. And a lot of people say that what we have in the USA is military Keynesianism. But really, I think what we did in the 1950s, after the death of Roosevelt, the rise of Truman, the beginnings of McCarthyism, we adopted Schachtian economic policies, where it's basically, it started out with just a military industrial complex, but then in the 80s, 70s and 80s, we started moving toward a prison industrial complex, where it's like, we can spend money, to keep the economy going. We just can't be nice to people with the money. We can't give people jobs. We can't pay for people's college. We're not going to be nice with our money. We are going to spend money on mechanisms of destruction and repression as a means of rebooting the economy. And I think that fits in with the overall pessimistic view that you find among some of the billionaires and monopolists, right? That they're at the top of the world, so, game over, right? It's like King of the Mountain. They get to the top of the hill and they announce, the game's over now because I'm at the top. And I think that a lot of the billionaires in the USA, that's why they push overpopulation. That's why, some of their talk of global warming isn't like, let's get beyond fossil fuels. It's like, well, everyone just has to stay poor because of global warming, and it's like that kind of mindset, among the rich, that history must end because we're at the top of the game. And if we continue to advance, things are going to shuffle. So we're going to spend money on beating people down and trying to hold back human progress. And I think that's the underlying assumption behind Schachtian economics, is that if we continue to advance, that's going to lead to things getting, great social upheaval, I guess you could say.
You sent a shiver down my spine when you mentioned that, and I just made that connection. I wouldn't normally say that the United States is fascist, but yeah, that's a direct, what we're doing, that is directly fascist.
Well, I think the Nazis did it really, really suddenly. It was like, boom, Hitler came into power, and dramatically took these moves. The economy boomed as a result of it. And then and then they were able to hold on to power until, the Second World War began, when they were starting to have a downturn and they needed to get things going again. But whereas in the United States, we've implemented these economic measures very gradually, right? The military industrial complex that arose very gradually, like during the war itself and then afterwards. and the prison industrial complex didn't come for another 40 years. And it's like we're using Nazi economic methods in the United States, but I think we've implemented them very, very gradually, and it hasn't been consistent. But yeah, I mean, the notion that the way you restart the economy is by beating people down, I think that is inherently fascist. And also, I would argue that the basis of fascism in a lot of ways is the assumption that the pie can only be this big. Because when the pie is only this big, the only way you can get a bigger slice for yourself is by taking away from somebody else's slice, right? And if the notion is the pie is only this big, inevitably sections of society are going to clash, right? Because everyone thinks that they don't have it good enough and that other people have it too good, and that's when you get a clash. But if you can get the idea that the pie is infinitely large, right, you can have social peace because people can work together, and that's the basis of it. And that's why I feel like no growth politics, that book that the Club of Rome put out, the Limits to Growth, it was a popular environmental manifesto in the early 70s. The Carter administration pushed it, and others. It was very, very dangerous, and it was essentially arguing that human progress can't expand, because the reality is millions of people around the developing world are going to rise up out of poverty. And if they don't do it with American companies, they're going to do it with Chinese companies. People are not going to accept living in poverty. Human beings advance. It's what we do. We've been doing it for 6, 7, 8,000 years. We've been getting better and advancing and creating new things and all of that. So that's the nature of human beings. We're a creative creature.
Now, I will mention with regard to the pie, because I've heard that argument from right libertarians as well, to try to say that, oh, well, there shouldn't be any socialism because you can always just get more because the pie infinitely expands. What's important to understand is, yeah, it's an infinitely expanding pie because, money isn't real. It's a measure of wealth. It's like it's real in the way that inches are real, or gender is real.
Right.
But what also matters is not just that the pie grows, but we also need equitable distribution of the pie. And this is something that I think people haven't really realized in a lot of ways, is that rich and poor are mutually dependent states. So for instance, right libertarians will sometimes say we need to make everybody a millionaire or a billionaire. Well, if you did that, you would essentially be dividing the infinitely growing pie into equal slices. And that would be great. I think that's a wonderful way. But being a millionaire or a billionaire in that context wouldn't actually mean anything. To be rich, in the sense that you're super rich and you can command the labor of hundreds with very minor investments, it is only able to happen because so many people have less and their labor has been devalued. So imagine if everyone's a billionaire, how much are you going to have to pay Bill Gates to come by and debug your computer? Or Michael Bloomberg to be a waiter at your next function. So I think what's important is not just that we focus on growing that pie, but also that we focus on making sure that we have equitable distribution that does not cause social dysfunction. Again, it's not just the level of real poverty, but the level of not absolute poverty, but the level of relative poverty and inequality that we really have to keep in mind.
Right, but the goal is ultimately to expand the living standard for everyone. Right, is to if you think of it not in terms of how much currency people have, right, because that's going to be relative to, but if you think of it in terms of the living standard of living, the relative comfort, the amount of free time people have, the nutritional calorie intake, the access to health care, these kind of things. I think the goal is to expand that for everyone, right? And the maximum amount of prosperity for the human race. And that always has been the goal. Well, it's been really a pleasure to talk to you, Brent. I know it's a little bit later than we had planned, but I think it all worked out. I know the comic book is coming along. You've got some exciting developments on that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to your next debate. It's going to be in a week or so, right?
Yeah, it's going to be a week, the Sunday of the 28th. It'll be capitalism versus socialism versus communism, I think. There's going to be me against an ANCAP that I know who's pretty sharp, and he's an econ student, so I'm looking forward to it. There'll be some other people involved, too. I think it's a four-way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who else is involved? I mean, I'm curious.
It's two other people from modern day debate, and then this ANCAP that I know. Okay. I don't think either of us have talked or debated with them, but one of them was watching my debate with JF and was really great in the comments. So he's going to be my ally in this. Yeah, but we'll do that. And also, I just wanted to ask one thing before we go, by the way, because I got to ask, as far as Kokesh at the end, should I be worried? Do you have a new best friend now? Because he seemed to bomb you.
That was a little bit weird. I didn't expect it to get that chummy. That was a little bit weird, and I've looked over some of the things he said before, and I certainly don't endorse them. And thanks for asking that. Yeah, that was a little bit weird. It was a little too, I was worried they were going to start playing the song from Love Story or something. I mean, it was a little weird. Like, it's like, I'm glad we were respectful to each other, but it got a little sappy there. It was like, I don't think I've ever met him in person in my whole life. I did a podcast with him one time with Sean Stone, the filmmaker and such. We did a podcast once before. But yeah, it got a little sappy there at the end. I'm not sure what that's about, but people can speculate. But we're not best buds. We're not hanging out. We're not hanging out at the beach. But yeah, that was a little bit strange. But hey, absolutely. I'm glad he likes my work. Let me put it that way. So
you know what? He at least engaged in good faith. Molyneux refused to, so I'll count that as a feather in his cap.
By his own confession, he loves drugs. That was a line from the debate. So perhaps the substances, people can get a little huggy, and
I wasn't going to say it, but yeah,
they're
maybe
everyone's best friend. Yeah, maybe he was just in a really, really friendly mood because of some substances or something. I don't know. Up to him, and that's his personal choice, right? He can put into his body whatever he wants. That's what he said. So there you go.
I'm of the mind that if you are an adult and it's safe and you do whatever you want, especially if it's in the realm of psychedelics or Mandy / Molly.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Brent, and all my best wishes.
Absolutely. I'll catch you later, Caleb.
Yep.